now to NBC's Martin Fletcher, who is there. Martin, no additional attacks on Tel Aviv or other parts of Israel in the last hour or so. The big question remains, what does Israel do now? Do you have any answers for us?
Afraid not, Tom. We know that the chief of staff, the defense minister, the generals are meeting in the defense ministry in Tel Aviv. They're discussing what to do. The question, of course, is what they'll do, when they'll do it, and whether they'll do it immediately or whether they'll wait for the United States to take out those missiles. But of course, as we've just heard, America's doing what it can and doesn't seem to have been enough. So I think Israel will probably wait to see what the current American raids achieve, and if they aren't sure that those missiles have, if they aren't sure the missiles have been taken out, I guess I'm pretty sure they'll go and do it themselves, because I don't think they can afford a second raid on their city.
No, and Martin Fletcher, we had Dr. Kissinger in here just a few moments ago, and others saying that what makes the most sense from everyone's point of view is for Israel to launch a surgical missile strike against other missile sites inside Iraq, that may be an acceptable level for the rest of the Arab world. Does that make sense to you from your perspective?
It certainly makes sense, Tom. There isn't much talk of it here, mind you. Certainly, the talk has always been of what the Air Force can do, but it makes a lot of sense. Israel does have the capability, the long-range missiles, the Jerichos, to strike Iraqi bases and Iraqi missile sites. It makes a lot of sense. It also avoids the key problem, which is how would the Air Force fly to those bases? And there are three ways: over Saudi Arabia, over Jordan, and over the north through Syria. Syria seems to be out. They have flown over Saudi in the past, but the head of the Israeli Air Force, Avi bin Nun, at a press conference last week said, in all likelihood, Israel would, if they flew to Iraq, go over Jordan. And of course, King Hussein of Jordan has said, if any planes fly into our airspace, we'll try and shoot them down. That's exactly what America, the coalition, wants to avoid. Israel's cognizant of that fact. They don't want to lose the coalition either. It makes sense, a ground-to-ground missile assault. It's an option, that's all I could say, Tom.
NBC's Martin Fletcher, stand by there in Tel Aviv as we come back to New York here now with the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Yoram Aridor. Mr. Ambassador, the whole world is wondering tonight, what will your government do?
Israel, of course, reserves itself the right to defend itself. And it will use this right as it sees fit in the circumstances, and it will decide when and if to exercise this right.
But what are the conditions that cause you to think about striking back? Casualties are light, property damage is not extensive. It did hit in an area of innocent civilians, no question about that. But the United States already has a massive air raid underway against Iraq. What possible further damage could you do that the United States cannot be doing right now?
I will not enter into military considerations. The right for self-defense is an inherent right of every country, including Israel. How to use or exercise this right is within the discretion and the decision of the Israeli government.
All right, Mr. Ambassador, I can tell that we're not going to get an answer until probably after it has happened. We do appreciate you coming by tonight. We're going to continue with our coverage here on America Goes to War, Operation Desert Storm, right after this. Let's go now to Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, where we have correspondents standing by. NBC's Arthur Kent. As you can see, it is dawn now over the Persian Gulf, and planes have been taking off once again, Arthur.
That's right, Tom. 2 Tornado ground attack planes, we can only assume, sent out to intensify the attacks against Saddam Hussein's Iraq for military targets there, perhaps scud launching sites. And Tom, just over 90 minutes ago, we had an example of the deadly serious, the lethal, but also the absurd nature of push-button warfare. We were also busy trying to analyze and understand what was going on in Tel Aviv and Israel with scud strikes there, but we didn't realize that we, in fact, were the subject of a a scud strike here. Only when we heard a loud noise and saw a smoke trail going off into the sky did we realize that it was possible that an anti-missile a Patriot missile, might have been launched at some incoming object. And of course, we discovered later on that a scud had in fact been destroyed on its way here by a Patriot missile.
Sir Kent, what are you hearing there about additional operations throughout the day? Just going to have a continuous wave of attacks going off from the Dhahran base?
Tom, we haven't seen anything breaking the routine, breaking the sort of cyclical launching on the hour of aircraft. In fact, it was a rather quiet night. We'll have to see how things establish over the next few hours. But certainly, interesting to watch today will be the Saudi reaction, the Kuwaiti reaction, the Arab reaction within this coalition to those scud landings in Israel and the prospect of an Israeli counterstrike at Iraq. Because when this operation began, it was not just supported by the United States Arab allies here. Saudi aircraft were in the attack. The Kuwaitis were up flying yesterday. They lost a plane, shot down. So the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Arabs have been very much a part of this assault. Very interesting to see how their air operations might change. Tom?
All right, thank you very much. NBC's Arthur Kent in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Arthur, we're going to go now back to Tel Aviv. We have some videotape of the damage that was done in that Scud missile attack there in the city. It was in the southern part of Tel Aviv. Gas masks were put on because it was initially believed, gas masks and chemical suits, it was initially believed that one of the warheads did contain some kind of chemical weapon. Later, it was determined that it did not. The Israeli, the IDF as they're called, Israeli Defense Force, out. Tel Aviv is a large seaside city, not a high-rise town. It's got some high-rise hotels right along the coast, but in the area where it hit, there are some seaside restaurants, and it is a working-class neighborhood described by the ambassador Chaval as a place where a lot of elderly people live. We do not believe that the casualties were very great there. Pretty considerable damage there, as you can see in the building. Rabbi Saperstein, what can you tell us about what you think that the Israelis will do now?
Well, again, if they can, they have a political decision to make, Tom. There'll be many considerations. If they believe they will be hit again, and they can pinpoint where some of the remaining missiles are, I think not only it is likely, but clearly they're right to move to try to mitigate that possibility. After all, the whole country, as I think the whole world, has a strange mix of feelings. Intense relief that so few were hurt, but this enormous sense of outrage over the choice of targets. It's an enormous contrast between the U.S. and the Iraqis. The U.S. targeted military targets and did everything to spare innocent civilians. The Iraqis targeted only innocent civilians. And if anyone had any doubt that there are profound moral interests at stake in this crisis, this incident should put those doubts to rest.
Rabbi David Saperstein of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, thanks very much for being with us tonight with Joyce Starr there. Joyce, we will be hearing from you later in our coverage, but we do want to go now to the Pentagon, where NBC's Fred Francis is standing by. There has been only one American death in this operation so far, which is breathtaking and extraordinary given the scope of the military operation. Of course, that can be of no comfort whatsoever to the family of the American flyer who was killed in the initial bombing raids. And NBC's Fred Francis has more on that for us tonight. Fred.
Tom, the Pentagon officially lists Lieutenant Commander Michael S. Spiker of Jacksonville, Florida, as missing in action. However, his fellow pilots saw his aircraft blow up, over a target, we believe, inside Kuwait or southern Iraq. They say he is presumed dead, missing in action. Lieutenant Commander Michael Spiker, the first American killed in action, 33 years old, Tom, leaving a wife and 2 daughters in Jacksonville, Florida. He was off the USS Saratoga, the aircraft carrier. He was a pilot of an FA-18. That's a fighter attack bomber, the newest one in the United States Navy. And one hope was kept alive on Lieutenant Commander Michael Spiker for quite some time, some 10 hours today, because after his plane blew up, there was a strong emergency beacon that he had recovered, but they have determined that he has not, and he is officially listed as missing in action. Tom?
Fred, do we know anything more about those British flyers that were down after the sad news about the loss of an American flyer? There was some heartening news that the 2 British flyers were able to eject.
We were told that they ejected, and we were also told we don't want to talk about that, said a Pentagon official, just in case we might be able to rescue them.
All right, Fred Francis, thanks very much. Right now in Tel Aviv is Ehud Olmert, the Israeli health minister, a close advisor to Prime Minister Shamir. Is the Prime Minister up at this hour, Minister Olmert, and is he making a decision about what to do next?
Well, I can say that he's up. I can't tell you anything more about the deliberations process, but he's up from early morning.
Well, let me just put a proposition to you, that the damage was light. We know that it was innocent civilians that were hit, but they didn't take, there were no deaths. The wounding was not great. There were only 5 or 6 missiles altogether. You did expect a strike of some kind. The United States and its allies already have a massive bombing attack underway. Would it not be in Israel's best long-term interest to show prudence here and to show that it can be restrained?
Well, Tom, I certainly understand this point of view, and we heard this advice prior to the beginning of the fighting in the Gulf. On the other hand, you have to understand, and I'm sure that had you been to Israel today, you may have felt differently. Unlike the other participants, the only country which is directly threatened, the only civilians in the world which are directly threatened, although they are away from the scene, are the Israelis. And when the whole country was awakened today by the sound of the sirens, it wasn't very pleasant for many of us. Now, the fact that only 6 or 7 missiles indeed landed in Israel today doesn't mean that many more will not come. If you remember, yesterday when we discussed the situation and you tried to comfort me, I said, hang on, wait, it's not yet over for us, it may still come. And now I tell you again, it's not yet over for us, it still can come, and we have to think of the best possible way to defend the people of Israel.
Thank you, Minister Ehud Olmert, who is the health minister and, more importantly, a close political advisor to Yitzhak Shamir. To sum up for you, Scud missiles fired in Tel Aviv, damage relatively light, few casualties, but nonetheless, it was an important symbolic act. A Scud missile fired at Dhahran as well, but it was intercepted. Continuing coverage on NBC.
The crisis turns to war, and America turns to NBC News. Wherever news breaks, whatever it takes.
This is a News Center special report. War in the Persian Gulf.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Pat Callahan. We will rejoin NBC's continual coverage of America at war in just a few minutes, but we wanted to bring you up to date on what is happening here. First, for anyone who may have just tuned in, here are the latest extremely serious developments in the war. Iraq has launched a missile attack against Israel. At least 3, perhaps a dozen or more missiles have landed in Tel Aviv. It was originally feared they contained chemical warheads. However, it now appears they did not. The Pentagon has also confirmed Iraqi air attacks in Saudi Arabia, but there are no reports that any coalition bases have been hit. And the U.S. continues its air assault on Iraq and Iraqi installations in Kuwait. This, then, is the theater of war tonight, expanded west from the Gulf into Israel. And this is, of course, of great concern to President Bush that Israel would be drawn into the conflict and that the carefully crafted coalition of Arab nations might be upset. Israel has not yet retaliated, and it remains to be seen whether or not that will happen. Maine Republican Senator William Cohen says it would be a mistake for Israel to retaliate just yet. He says Israel knows there is a lot at stake for the fragile anti-Iraq coalition, and he hopes the Israelis will decide the damage was minor enough not to require an immediate response.
They don't have to prove either their manhood or their nationhood. I think the doctrine of their response, lex talionis, an eye for an eye, and disproportionate response at that is well established. I think under these circumstances, given the major success that the Allied forces have had during the first day, it would be a misjudgment in my judgment if the damage is limited for the risk to be undertaken to jeopardize that relationship. But
Cohen is a member of the Armed Services Committee. Most of the people we talked to tonight say they expected Iraq to attack Israel sooner or later, and now that it has happened, many of them say they are concerned about the implications.
What's your reaction? I'm not at all surprised. No, because I really thought they would do that before this.
I have family in Tel Aviv.
In Tel Aviv?
And also in other areas of Israel. So this kind of hits home a lot.
Well, I hope Israel goes in and cleans them up so we can get our boys home.
I don't know. I think all hell's going to break loose shortly.
Hundreds of thousands of people across the country have responded to the chaos in the Middle East by protesting and proclaiming their dissent to anyone who will listen.
It's all about big business, man. It's all about the Bush administration's support of the defense industry. It's all about the Bush administration's continued support for the oil industry. It's not about human life. It's absolutely not about human life, man.
More than 100 protesters lined Forest Avenue by the Federal Building in Portland tonight and yelled anti-war slogans to people driving by. They say U.S. troops are in the Gulf for all the wrong reasons. A handful of counter-demonstrators see things differently.
You can talk. Support our president. America, USA. Love her to leave her to
No clashes between the two sides have been reported, and police say the demonstration remained orderly. But in Bangor tonight, protesters scuffled with police when the officers blocked a group of about 300 people marching down Harlow Street. Police say the group did not hold a parade permit, and at least one protester was arrested in Bangor. The Defense Department has set up special phone numbers for those wanting information about relatives serving in Operation Desert Storm. These numbers are for immediate family members only. For those serving in the Army, the number is 703-614-0739. In the Air Force, the information number is 1-800-253-9276. For those in the Navy, family members can call 1-800-732-1206. And for the Marines, call 1-800-523-2694. You must have very specific information about the person, including their name, unit, and Social Security number.
Arab coalition will fall apart and suddenly side with Saddam Hussein is probably, at best, ludicrous. And the reason is because the Saudis and the Kuwaitis are hardly likely to side with Saddam Hussein. And the Syrians, there is, of course, no love lost. So the Egyptians are with us fully. The Turks, who are we really talking about in terms of siding with Saddam Hussein?
But Mubarak at least did raise the possibility that he would sit on the sidelines, and then he was reminded of that $30 billion forgiveness of loans that we recently arranged.
Well, of course, the Israelis are not going to bomb Baghdad, and they're not going to go in with ground forces. Whatever they do will be very limited, and I think that you can expect that the Arab coalition supporting the United States will remain intact. But another interesting point, which is rarely stated, is that Saddam Hussein knew full well that his missiles were going to hit Palestinians as well as Israelis, and so the argument that he was fighting on behalf of the Palestinian cause is also ludicrous.
Joy Starr, what are you thinking tonight as you look at the situation with Israel now under attack, the American bombing raids continuing against Iraq? What gives you some pause?
Well, I'm afraid that the first day the Israelis were practically jubilant because they felt that the war was not going to touch Israel. But today, it's a reminder, an old reminder, that they really are quite vulnerable and alone and have to defend themselves. I guess that there are many Israelis, I've spoken to some people there this evening, who are asking why didn't the United States prevent this from happening? Even if the United States does intend to respond, why did it happen at all? And so it's very difficult to dislodge that sense of fear from the Israeli mind, and of course that affects the peace process as well.
If this all goes according to plan, do you think that the Palestinian question will be raised in some kind of an international conference within a year to 18 months?
I think that there was a movement on the Palestinian issue over the summer. I was in Israel in July, and as you may recall, when Moshe Aarons took the post of Minister of Defense, he made a strong outreach to the Palestinians in the territories, and I think that there was the beginning of a dialogue when Saddam Hussein moved into Kuwait. I do think that there will be a kind of peace process in the coming year, but not because Saddam Hussein has willed it.
All right, Joyce Starr, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Joyce Starr has written a book called Kissing Through Glass, The Invisible Shield Between the United States and Israel. It is very often a synergistic relationship in which the two countries help each other, and it is very often a symbiotic relationship in which the two countries appear to consume each other. And tonight you can pick your choice because this is a very tricky time between Israel and the United States. President Bush has expressed his outrage. Obviously, he also has hopes that Israel will not do anything that will make an already inflamed situation worse than it is. Israel, for its part, feels compelled that it must strike back, must reserve the right to strike back in its own defense. NBC's Arthur Kent is in Saudi Arabia, and he has a report for us on what has been going on over there. Arthur?
Tom, as you know, the attack that we've seen over the last 2 days has been long awaited by U.S. forces here in the Gulf. For many of the pilots, the ground crews, and the missile batteries, the chance to finally put to practical use all that they've been training for is a cause for celebration.
It's the first time I've ever seen anything like this. It's pretty nice. This time, you know, waiting. Hopefully this will land.
Total destruction, like it's supposed to be happening. That's what's supposed to happen.
The city is just lit up with it looks like a bunch of sparkles just going off across the entire city.
Our young maintenance kids around here, they're the real heroes in this.
How'd it go, buddy?
The air-to-ground guys did a magnificent job. Just a magnificent job.
Been a very fortunate fellow. Led a really swell life. Lord blessed me with a good woman. He made me an American fighter pilot.
This is what we're here for right there. That's what it's all about.
And so, Tom, at this daybreak on the second full day of daylight operations for this operation, we see F-15s taking off, British Tornado jets taking off. An exciting time for U.S. forces and for their allies here.
Thanks very much. Arthur Kent, who's reporting to us tonight from Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Someone who's watching all of this with more care than the rest of us, understandably, is Phyllis Pope. She's the wife of Air Force pilot Lieutenant Colonel Pope. They have 4 youngsters, 2 boys, 2 girls. He's with the 71st Tactical Fighter Wing. Isn't that right, Mrs. Pope? Tactical.
Yes, it is.
I got it all right. It's the
Yes.
71st Tactical Fighter Wing. Wing commander?
No, actually it's the 71st Tactical Fighter Squadron, and he's the squadron commander.
He's the squadron commander. Have you seen him in our coverage here today?
No, I haven't.
When did you last talk to him?
I last talked to him on Saturday evening.
And what did he say at that time?
He said that he was fine, he was ready, prepared for anything that was going to happen, and that we shouldn't worry.
This is a true living room war. You are sitting there in your living room and you are watching Air Force pilots and others take off and go on bombing raids where there is an enormous amount of peril. We do know that they are well trained, but at the same time you must have some real anxieties.
Yes, I do. It's actually mixed emotions. I know how well trained they are, and I have to rely on the confidence that my husband says that he has in himself and his fellow pilots.
Has he always wanted to be a pilot?
Yes, he has.
Has he ever been in combat before?
No, he hasn't.
Did he talk about that at all, the fact that it was no longer going to be a training mission, that they faced the prospect now of live fire?
No, he really didn't go into that with me at all.
You have been listening, I'm sure, tonight to these reports as we talk about light casualties. Only 2 American flyers lost so far as we know. Does that give you any comfort at all, or is just 1 loss too much?
It's not much of a comfort because 1 loss really is too much.
And what about the other wives? How are they doing?
I think that we're all doing very well. We were all here this afternoon here at my house, and everyone's spirits were up. We were watching all the different networks that we're on, and we just rallied around each other, and that made us all feel really terrific just to be together.
Phyllis Pope, there are so many things that I would like to ask you. I guess the toughest question is, do you ever stop thinking about it? Do you wake up in the middle of the night?
I never stop thinking about it, no.
Okay. And the kids are okay?
The kids are okay.
All right. Well, we're confident that Colonel Pope is as well. We thank you very much for being with us tonight. And you keep your eyes on NBC, and we'll see if we can't turn up Colonel Pope and put him on the screen for you at some point, okay?
Thank you.
All right. We'll try very hard to do that.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. Phyllis Pope, who's the wife of a pilot with the 71st, I got to get this right, Tactical Fighter Squadron. He is the squadron commander. NBC's Arthur Kent in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Arthur?
Tom, we've been watching early morning air operations here, as well as the warplanes taking off, heading off for their interceptor duties, their bombing duties. We've seen some transports. Just a short while ago, a C-5A, a giant, mammoth transport plane, taking off, rising rather quickly from the runway, obviously empty, heading back possibly for Germany to pick up another load of probably sophisticated weaponry. Most of the hardware and the more common bits of ammunition and military equipment is coming in by ship, a vast number of ships. But quite a bit of sophisticated weaponry is flown in on these C-5As, and again, a never-ending logistical trail leading here, supporting the operation heading into Iraq and Kuwait.
All right. Arthur Kent, do we expect that these tactical fighter wings will just be running one sortie after another? When do the pilots sleep? What is their rotation? Can you describe that for us at all?
Rotation, I'm not certain of the exact hours that they've been flying. It's been difficult for us to get through to the squadrons, talk to the squadron commanders.
Where is
typically each pilot and his wingmate or his squadron would be heading off in the assigned teams. Some of the sorties have been as long as 3 hours, 45 minutes, in some cases 4 hours, then returning to base. Typically the pilots, if they are not returning immediately to pursue the same objective, they would be debriefed and their aircraft prepared. That can sometimes take only 30 minutes, and off they would go again. All of these pilots, though extremely motivated and would be willing, I'm sure, and eager to fly repeated missions, but certainly a lot of aircraft here, a lot of pilots, and what we've seen so far, very careful, well thought out, a very meticulous plan. So they'll be trying to put the best planes together with the best pilots, resting people, and putting them out to gain the greatest effect in those strikes at military targets in Kuwait and Iraq.
Arthur Kent, thanks very much. We're going to go down to Washington, D.C. We're going to put together NBC's John Cochran, who's at the White House, and NBC's Fred Francis at the Pentagon. Let them give us the points of view from the opposite sides of the Pentagon, close coordination, of course, between the new Center for the Military and the Commander-in-Chief's residence, the White House. John Cochran, we begin with you.
All right, I suppose first we have to talk about the White House feeling about the attacks on Israel. And what the White House has done, what President Bush has done, is basically said, let us take care of the retaliation. The president issued a written statement expressing his outrage at the Iraqi missile attack on Tel Aviv and Haifa, the Haifa area in northern Israel. The president hopes that Israel will stay out of this for political reasons. It is a political decision as far as the White House is concerned. The White House saying to the Israelis, we're terribly sorry you had to suffer this way. We appreciate the fact that you endured a first strike on our behalf for our political reasons, and now that you have endured that strike, please let us retaliate on your behalf. And the best reading I can get here is that they honestly do not know at the White House, that they don't have an absolute assurance yet. I'm not sure that that political and military decision has been made by Israeli authorities, Tom. Fred?
plan that they've laid out over 5 months. You know, they don't want interruptions in it. They don't want the Israelis taking a chunk of it, either firing missiles or launching their own attack, you know, against Baghdad. The plan has worked for the first 24 hours, and they'd like to go on with it. We believe they have up to 10 days of bombing plan until they get all their targets in a row, and then if Saddam doesn't capitulate, then they'll have to move ground forces in. It's all part of a master plan that's been tinkered with and worked on for so very long. The greatest problem they have is obviously the political one, and they don't think the coalition will fall apart here, but they don't want their plan to fall apart because it's worked so well. So, but they know that they are instruments here of the White House, and they're instruments of political policy, and they will follow orders. And they also know that this is not the first disruption of their plan. They know that, John, that war disrupts all plans, whether it be Murphy's Law or the fog of war. So they want to go ahead.
Yeah, but I got to tell you, we're going to see a lot less of the casual atmosphere we've had around here today. Now, even though the president was warning us not to be overconfident, he was telling congressional leaders, telling us today, the reporters here at the White House, look, it's early days yet. There still was, if not a feeling of euphoria, they were feeling pretty darn good around here by the time that the president left the Oval Office this evening to go over to the residential part of the White House. The president joking with reporters. He said, when we tried to question him, he said, well, I'm not going to answer your questions. I'm my way over to home. I don't have to answer questions when I'm walking home in the evening. And he turned over to his aides and said, well, you think I ought to surrender? And of course, that was a little inside joke because we've been talking all day about the president's usage of the word surrender in terms of Saddam Hussein. There was this little controversy, a little flap around here. It seemed that President Bush earlier on had sort of raised the stakes by indicating that Saddam Hussein must surrender. And when we think of surrender, we think of somebody capitulating entirely, laying down their arms, saying, I give up, I will resign my office and possibly be a prisoner of war, and your forces can occupy my country. And of course, George Bush said, that's not what I mean at all. All I'm merely saying is that Saddam Hussein must comply with the UN resolutions, Fred.
Yeah, it was a poor choice of words, and when they heard the word surrender, the military men sort of, you know, shuddered over here. As far as there being more hiccups and more blips that disrupt the overall plan, you know, there are many more things we haven't seen yet. We haven't seen terrorism. We haven't seen other kinds of missiles. You know, we haven't seen oil refineries on fire. We're going to see a lot of those things in the next couple of days, and they know that here, and they know that war is not one-sided, no matter how well this one started. So,
Fred, let me jump in here. We've just been issued a written statement by the President's press secretary, Marlin Fitzwater, and I'm just going to read it to you. It's something that we actually have been reporting. We've been reporting it on the basis of the sources we talked to. Now they've made it official. The United States has been in touch with the government of Israel to express its outrage over the missile attacks by Iraq. Secretary of State Baker discussed this matter with Prime Minister Shamir by telephone from the White House tonight. Secretary Baker assured the Prime Minister that the United States is continuing its efforts to eliminate this threat. The United States expects to remain in close consultation with Israel on this issue. The U.S. has also been in contact with its coalition partners. The President has been kept informed of these developments and remains in the residence. That is to say, the part of the White House over here behind me. You see the working part of the White House, the West Wing of the White House, and this is where the President's advisors, including Secretary of State Baker, have been working out of tonight in the National Security Advisor's office. That is to say, Brent Scowcroft. So, Freddie, I think we can say that what we've been reporting has been accurate, and I see nothing in this statement that indicates that Prime Minister Shamir told Jim Baker, we definitely will not bomb Iraq.
No, I don't think there's a promise there at all. I don't think there's even a hope. You know, they will take what comes. You know, if Israel decides to react, that will that will be in the cards, and they'll go on with that. And Tom, I think here at the Pentagon, they're waiting to see today what Israel does and how it affects the overall game plan vis-a-vis this bombing campaign against Iraq. Tom?
Fred Francis, thank you very much. John Cochran at the White House. I am grateful to you as well for spelling me here for just a a moment or two. We are coming up on 11:25 p.m. Eastern Time, Eastern Standard Time here in New York. It is now coming up on 7:25 in the morning in Baghdad and throughout Iraq and throughout Kuwait as well. Military targets still under attack there. They'll have daylight now in which to make some satellite reconnaissance photographs so that they can assess just how much damage has been done, what targets they have to go back and hit again and maybe again and again. Maybe they'll even see the mobile missile launchers. We'll be back after this. We're back, and we're going to go to Los Angeles now, where there's a sizable peace demonstration underway tonight. There were anti-war demonstrations today in Boston, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in Washington, D.C. as well. There have been scattered reports of violence, but at the federal building in Los Angeles now, which I believe is the one, yes, it's the one in West Los Angeles, fairly sizable crowd for the second night in a row in Los Angeles. And this was the scene today in San Francisco, where there were some confrontations between police and protesters as well. Right. Now let's go to Ron Kovic, who is one of this country's best-known peace activists, a man who was gravely wounded in Vietnam, wrote a book called Born on the 4th of July, which was made into an award-winning film, and he is there with us now. Mr. Kovic, what is your judgment about what is going on in the Persian Gulf tonight?
Tom, I just came from UCLA, and I just want to report to you that over 700 students have taken over the main administration building. They are planning to shut down the entire campus tomorrow, and this is a very powerful peace movement that's growing across this country. And I think, Tom, with what's happening in the Middle East, you are going to see an extremely powerful anti-war movement growing very rapidly in this country. There is a cry that's going out amongst thousands and thousands of us, and that is, bring our young men and women home, let them live. We do not want this war, and we want the killing and the bombing to stop, Tom. We are against this killing, we are against this bombing, and we know that there has got to be a peaceful solution. We're crying out for peace all over this country, and we're going to sit down in the streets. We're going to take over the bridges, the buildings. We're going to sit in the senator's office and the congressman's offices. We're going to take over the universities peacefully and non-violently. But if we have to shut down this whole country, Tom, we're going to do that.
Ron Kovic, what about the chances for a peaceful solution? Saddam Hussein was given every conceivable opportunity to withdraw his troops from Kuwait, and he took none of them. You cannot deal with this man, it seems, from a diplomatic or a political point of view. Ultimately, how would you deal with him?
We must avoid killing, and we must avoid the destruction of other human beings and innocent civilians, Tom. There are ways, there is dialogue, there is still room for peace, and I feel that more and more people across this country are beginning to oppose the president and the war makers. We're not going to stand for this war, Tom. We are not going to stand for this killing. We are better Americans than that. We are better Americans than that, Tom. We want peace, and we know that this is not the way to go.
Ron.
They killed a million Vietnamese and put the names of 58,000 of my friends on a wall in Washington, D.C. We're not going to let them do it again, Tom. We're not going to let them do it again.
All right, thank you very much. Ron Kovic tonight at a very sizable anti-war demonstration at the federal building in West Los Angeles. Ron Kovic, of course, who had, I think, 2 tours in Vietnam, was wounded in the second one. He is paralyzed from the waist down. He has very passionate feelings about the issue of war and peace. He wrote about them in a book called Born on the 4th of July. Later, Oliver Stone made it into, as I say, an award-winning film. Do we have enough time to go see Richard Lieber in Georgetown? Okay. We'll get to him in a minute. I just want to give you an update on where we stand at this hour so that you'll have a fix on that when we resume our coverage. At this hour, we await a decision by the Israeli government about whether to strike back or not against the Iraqis after Saddam Hussein launched missiles at Tel Aviv and the port of Haifa in Israel, possibly as many as 10 missiles altogether. None contained any chemical weapons. Casualties were reasonably light. Nonetheless, he did strike at the heart of a neighborhood that contained only innocent civilians. It was not a military target. Also, a Scud missile launched tonight at the Dhahran Air Force complex in northeastern Saudi Arabia, where most of the foreign journalists are based, and also the F-15 contingents. It was intercepted successfully by a Patriot missile. This is now coming up on the second complete day, second complete cycle of Operation Desert Storm. Will continue in a moment.
News. America at War continues. Here is Tom Brokaw.
Good evening, everyone. NBC News now resumes its coverage of Operation Desert Storm, America at War. The situation tonight is that Tel Aviv has come under attack by Scud missiles from Iraq. Casualties reasonably light, property damage very heavy indeed. The political implications are grave. If Saddam Hussein can lure Israel into this war in a major way, would he then break up the Arab alliance? That's the question that hangs in the air tonight, the question of whether Israel will strike back and to what magnitude. That we cannot say. There has been no word from the Israeli government, except a number of their spokesmen have said, we reserve the right to defend ourselves. The working rule within the Israeli government is they strike first, tell us about it later. So we'll await the word from the Israeli government tonight. Also, a Scud missile launched in Dhahran, and bombing attacks continue tonight against military targets in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia. That's the situation on the ground in the Persian Gulf. We want to go now to Amman, Jordan, and we want to show you, as we do that, some of the videotape that we're receiving, courtesy of the BBC, that is coming out of Iraq. We can show that now or not. This is Baghdad last night. The first pictures that we have seen of the aerial firepower. This is when the attack was first underway. Anthony Massey is a producer for the BBC. He is in our studios in Amman, Jordan tonight. Let me ask you the first and obvious question, Mr. Massey. How did you get out of Baghdad?
Well, it took us a long time. We drove across the whole of Iraq. Excuse me, my voice is going because we've had nothing to eat and drink for 2 days and 2 nights. Across the whole of Iraq and the whole of Jordan. And we arrived here in Amman about, 5 minutes ago.
You were in Baghdad at the time of the attack?
Yes, I was.
And how long after the initial attack did you decide to leave?
We left at lunchtime Baghdad time when our office in London ordered us out, and it was clear that it was just going to go on and on and on.
All right, we're going to show some tape simultaneously here, Mr. Massey, of some people who were injured. Based on your eyewitness reports, how much damage done, A, to military targets? How many civilian casualties were there?
Well, it's impossible for us to assess, excuse me, impossible for us to assess the civilian casualties, but the damage to military targets was very precise. It was very noticeable that they hit exactly what they wanted and did minimal damage to buildings around that. For example, I watched the telecommunications center be blown up, and the damage to the buildings around it appeared to be absolutely minimal. It was a very skilled and precise operation.
How many of your people did you leave behind in Baghdad, and do you know where they are tonight?
Well, when I left them, they were in the Al Rashid, excuse me, Al Rashid Hotel. There are 3 BBC people left, and I came out with 3 of my colleagues, but in a party of 14 other Western journalists.
Yeah. In the closing hours, how did the Iraqi officials treat you as a Westerner, especially as a Brit, because the British have been high visibility here in this Allied attack?
Well, they were very courteous and proper to us in Baghdad, where we've got to know them quite well. At the border, they became more hostile and started to use phrases like enemy, which we've not heard before. But the real difference was how their own attitude to the war had changed, how they were now becoming much more depressed as they realized that this is going to go on, and it is something that they just can't handle.
Do you think that they were surprised by the scope of the attack when that first wave came in from Operation Desert Storm?
Oh, absolutely, no doubt. They were both at a government and a popular level. They were astonished, shocked. They didn't expect it to happen at all. They didn't expect it to happen in the way it did under any circumstances. People talk how they have 8 years of experience of the Gulf War, but they have no experience of the kind of thing that was put against them the other night. And it was just something that they were not ready for and are still not ready for.
Tell me about your drive across the Iraqi plain and then the Jordanian desert. Did you see any military activity in the course of that drive?
Yes, very much so. It was all quiet through most of yesterday during the daytime until we reached the town of Rutba. And then we passed through that town just after we had gone. There was a heavy Allied air raid on that town, taking the same pattern as Baghdad, which is missiles arrive, whether fired as standoff missiles by excuse me, by Allied planes or as cruise missiles. The Iraqis respond with a lot of anti-aircraft fire, which is of no use, but makes a lot of noise, actually does some damage to themselves. And we saw explosions on the ground as the cruise missiles found their targets.
Yeah, I don't worry about the satellite staying up. I do worry about your voice staying up, so we'll take a couple of more questions and we'll let you get some well-deserved rest. What was it like in the hotel at the time of the attack?
Well, we felt a lot safer up on the upper floors than in the bomb shelter, which was very claustrophobic. Upstairs, you could see what was going on, but if you open a window, you could actually feel the heat as cruise missiles landed up to a mile away. They really made a hell of an impact, terrific impact.
That's right. You can say it was a hell of an impact because that's precisely what it was. Could you hear,
what it was indeed.
Could you hear their motors before they landed?
The most you heard was a whoosh right above your head, and then a huge bang, and that was when the cruise missiles arrived.
What about aircraft? What about aircraft?
You heard and saw no aircraft. You heard a great deal of noise from the Iraqis as they put up their useless anti-aircraft fire. They actually shot the top off their own transmitter mast at the TV station, but they couldn't hit any American or British planes because they were just not there to be hit. They were too far away.
Yeah. I was in Baghdad over the weekend, you know, right before this fighting all began, and I was so struck by the hubris of the Iraqi leadership, the kind of self-confidence and indeed arrogance of them. Did that fade away after the initial attack?
Yes, you're absolutely right about their attitude in that way, but among some of the senior and middle-ranking government officials, by lunchtime yesterday, they were very depressed, and really they were starting to become very worried for their future.
Did they confide in you at all about what they thought Saddam Hussein might do or what they wished that he would do?
Well, they did not. They wouldn't confide in what they wished him to do because they're just not used to doing that. And I don't think any of them really have any idea what he wants to do because he keeps his own counsel with a very small group of people.
Anthony Massey, as you continue to talk here, we're going to show some more video that you brought out. This is more of the nighttime attack. I think these are the opening hours of Operation Desert Storm. The BBC, we're very grateful to them for sharing this with us. I think that's looking to the west of the city, out near the airport, probably.
Yes, that's right. The red and yellow flashes you'll see are the Iraqi anti-aircraft fire. The silver explosions near the ground are cruise missiles finally hitting their targets. It was really quite something. It started at 20 to 3 in the morning Baghdad time and went on for several hours with gaps in between. And as I say, just totally took them by surprise. They were not ready for it.
There's been almost no counterattack whatsoever. A few missiles into Israel tonight, one launched towards Saudi Arabia, maybe a few more launched towards Saudi Arabia as well. Any explanation for that?
Well, I don't have the bigger picture of what the Allies have been able to do against the Iraqi forces, but I saw no evidence of Iraqi Air Force activity at all.
No planes launched, nothing.
No planes. The most we did see was some anti-aircraft missiles, one of which went past our office on the 5th floor, fired kind of parallel to the street, but not hitting anything at all, and it eventually hit an Iraqi building.
Mr. Massey, did you have any contact today with Iraqi citizens as you drove out of this country?
Sorry, I beg your pardon?
Did you have any contact with kind of ordinary Iraqis as you drove out of the country?
Yes, we did, and they shared the view of the government people we met. They were deeply shocked. They had never thought that it would come to this. They never believed it would come to this, and they're now very, very seriously worried for their country's future.
All right, thank you very much, Anthony Massey. There's a man there from NBC News by the name of Gordon Manning. He will buy you a pint, I'm sure, or do whatever is necessary to restore your health and your voice.
Thank you very much
for being with us tonight. We're deeply grateful for that account. Anthony Massey, a producer with BBC, who came out with a caravan of other journalists, I think 14 altogether, Western journalists, made what must have been a memorable drive out of Baghdad, through Iraq, and then through Jordan. He is in the capital tonight of Amman. Let's go to NBC's Martin Fletcher, who is in Tel Aviv at this hour. Martin?
Tom?
What's the latest there?
Well, Tom, now the government has said that people can leave their sealed homes, but their sealed rooms rather, but they must stay around the house. So that suggests that the Israeli government is sure there won't be another missile attack by Iraq on Israel, at least during the daytime. Nighttime could be another story. I'd just like to say one word, Tom, on the question of Israel's retaliation, which is, of course, the key subject of the moment. What will Israel do? Will Israel strike back at Iraq? From my sources, I'm absolutely convinced of one thing now, that if that attack had included chemical warheads of any kind, Israel's retaliation would have been immediate. As the attack was only conventional warheads, now they're deciding what to do.
Do we have some additional video there, Martin, of what happened during that attack? I think that, yeah, there it is. We'll look at this together. Some cars were hit, some buildings were hit, but the casualties were surprisingly light because that's a relatively densely populated neighborhood, isn't it?
That's right, Tom. It's one of the poorest suburbs of Tel Aviv. The missile landed smack in the middle of two buildings, destroyed, did considerable damage, a big hole. 3 floors of the buildings were damaged, furniture everywhere. The damage to people was so slight because Israel was in the middle of a state of emergency for exactly this circumstance. Israel was expecting a missile attack, and because they were so prepared, injuries were slight. Only 7 people slightly wounded in all of Israel.
That is amazing indeed. Will that be part of the equation as Prime Minister Shamir decides whether or not to launch the counterattack, or is just the fact of the attack on Israel alone enough for him to strike back?
Well, I think it's logical to a non-Israeli that it may not, that the slight damage to life and property may be a factor. You'd think that if not too much damage was done, maybe Israel could get away with not retaliating. But we've heard from Israeli leaders this morning on NBC that it's not the amount of damage that was done, it's the factor of the attack, and that the perception of Israel as a country that has to respond to attacks. Otherwise, it loses its deterrence in this very rough area of the world. So the leaders here were saying it's not a matter of how much damage was done, it's the fact any damage was done at all by missiles.
All right, NBC's Martin Fletcher tonight in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much. Let's go now to the White House and NBC's John Cochran. John, there's a story on the wire here that Secretary of State Baker talked on the telephone to Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. The Secretary assured the Prime Minister that the United States is continuing its efforts to eliminate the threat to Israel. Does that mean that President Bush did not talk with Shamir?
That's right. In fact, it was Secretary of State Baker. Jim Baker was doing all the phoning this evening, working in the offices just behind me here, over in the residential part of the White House off to my right. That's where President Bush stayed all this evening. I would have to say that the mood of the White House has changed dramatically, however. When the President earlier this evening left the Oval Office and walked over toward the residence, he ran into a group of reporters joking around with us, and he said, I'm not going to answer questions I don't have to answer questions when I'm walking home in the evening. Why should I surrender to you reporters? A sort of an inside joke because of the flap today over the use of surrender, whether or not Saddam Hussein would have to surrender to the United States. And it was a good joke or a bad joke, at least to show that the president was in a loose mood. That has all changed around here now. And in fact, the White House issued a statement not long ago talking about Jim Baker's discussion with Shamir. Let me read it to you because even though we can summarize it and paraphrase it, words are important. Let me just read something if I may be rude enough to read. Secretary Baker discussed the matter with Prime Minister Shamir by telephone tonight. The Secretary assured the Prime Minister that the United States is continuing its efforts to eliminate this threat. The U.S. expects to remain in close consultation with Israel. The U.S. has been in close contact with its coalition partners, and so forth. Nothing in there says that Prime Minister Shamir assured Jim Baker that Israel will not attack. And from everything I can garner, we have no assurances from the Israelis. All we know is that they say they reserve their right to defend themselves. And as you have pointed out earlier, Tom, Israel just doesn't like to talk with anybody about what it's going to do for very obvious security reasons, even with close partners like the United States.
All right, thank you very much. John Cochran at the White House. Secretary of State James Baker has been in touch directly by telephone with the Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir. He also telephoned the Israeli ambassador to the United States to express his outrage. The ambassador, in fact, said he could detect the real despair in his voice. This is a delicate time for the United States now, because if the Israelis do decide to counterstrike, there's another genie out of the bottle here, and we do not know what the reaction will be of the United States' Arab political partners in that part of the world, to say nothing of the people who are on the ground there, the Egyptian masses, what goes on in Syria, and the kind of pressure that they could put on their leaders. At the Pentagon, NBC's Fred Francis is there now. Fred, what do you have for us?
Tom, Secretary Cheney, Dick Cheney, and Chairman of the Joint Staff, Colin Powell, have gone home. And some other senior officials have also gone home. One official told me that it seems like the crisis has passed as far as an immediate Israeli response. They weren't talking about later tomorrow or the following day. I just think they don't know right now, and they don't want their air campaign interrupted by something like this. On the question of getting these targets, the Israelis were promised these targets would be hit, and apparently all of them were not hit. Even all of the hard targets, those permanent launch sites, all of them were not hit. And so if there's any increase in the air campaign, it is in those areas where they're going after as many of these targets as possible. So, but the immediate crisis of whether Israel will get into this war apparently has passed this building by at the moment. The next details that we hear about this will be 7 o'clock in the morning Eastern Standard Time, when the four-star general running the show, General Norman Schwarzkopf, will hold forth in a press briefing in Riyadh, and then we'll get later briefings during the day. Tom?
Fred Francis, we're going to ask you to stand by there. We're going to show you in Washington now Congressman Randall Cunningham, freshman Republican from California. He was the first fighter ace in Vietnam, and he is in our studios, as you can see. Congressman Cunningham, having been through combat yourself, what's your reaction tonight to the fact that we've had as many sorties as we have had, maybe more than 1,200 attacks from the air, and we have lost only 2 pilots, tragically for their families, no doubt about that, but that is an extraordinary success rate, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Tom, but I think you've seen in your last witness where the Iraqis are shooting their own buildings, they're knocking off towers with their own AAA. You're not dealing with rocket scientists. The pilots have got very poor air-to-air skill, and that's why they're not flying at night. Our pilots outmatch them. The Air Force and Navy pilots have both the Top Gun school and the adversary programs with the Air Force. And if they did launch their aircraft against us to try and create losses, we could take out that Air Force in very short order.
Have you been following this very carefully from your post in Congress, and what goes through your mind having been in combat yourself? Does it bring back old memories?
Oh, sure it does. Matter of fact, it was deja vu when we were voting for a vote of confidence with the president. I wrote a book, Tom, that talks about how Congress and the military got a lot of us killed in Vietnam by a lack of decision, by tying our hands. And I swore that if I ever had an opportunity to change that I would. When we made our votes, the president made his decision on facts. That's why the Congress gave him the support in the United Nations to go after the United Nations resolutions.
What about the impact of these anti-war demonstrations that are going on around the country? We are, after all, defending democratic values, and one of the first of the democratic values is the right to protest, to speak out, to express your own beliefs.
You bet, Tom. When I came back from Vietnam, I sat down with many of the anti-war protests and protesters. This country is so great because we have that right, but I'd also like to reiterate to this group that if this war goes on a very long time, I'll be in their midst carrying a sign right along with them. But for right now, I would like to see this nation with one resolve to get our people back home as quick as possible. You know, the druggers haven't gone away, the crime hasn't gone away in our cities, and every time I see an anti-war protest, I see large numbers of police having to police that area. We have more killings from drug traffickers than we do from terrorists, and that doesn't stop. We need to pay attention to that, and that diverts our police forces and our security forces from that. So I would ask that they make peaceful protests without any destruction if they want, but also to support what we're doing so we can get our troops back.
Congressman Cunningham, thanks very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Tom.
Combat veteran of flyer of the Vietnam era. In Washington right now is Professor Richard Lieber. He is the head of the political science department at Georgetown University. He's also a bona fide expert on Middle East affairs. Professor Lieber, as Israel tonight makes the decision whether to strike or not to strike back, what will be going through the minds of Yitzhak Shamir, Moshe Aarons, and the other members of the cabinet?
Well, I think retaliation of some kind is a virtual inevitability. First of all, the Israelis made the decision to accept the American request to sit tight until they were struck by the Iraqis. They could have preempted against those missile sites earlier. They had been threatened numerous times, and yet they sat tight and waited. They feel, I think, they've filled their end of the bargain in terms of being a good ally for the United States.
Were you surprised, Professor Lieber, that the Iraqis were able to make a successful, if not very damaging, missile attack right into the heart of Tel Aviv without anyone picking it up there?
Well, I think it surprised everyone, and the psychological consequences of this are important. For morale reasons, the Israelis, I think, the government is likely to want to reassure its own population by retaliating in some fashion against the Iraqis for this really cold-blooded attack against strictly civilian targets.
With or without an Israeli retaliation, will Saddam Hussein, in your judgment, attempt to go to the rest of the Arab world the next time we hear from them and say, I have attacked the Zionist infidel, and use that as some kind of leverage?
It won't work. I think the farther away you get from Saddam, the more people sometimes take him at face value. I must say, I think a lot of the concern, which I've heard on TV in the last few hours about the threat to the Allied coalition, is exaggerated. The Egyptians, the Saudis, even the Syrians have already made clear in recent days that provided Israel was struck first and was retaliating after having been hit, that for they themselves, although they might fuss about it a bit, it would not cause unprecedented problems or a breakup of the coalition. So while from our standpoint things would be a little more comfortable if the Israelis sat tight, I think, one, a retaliation of some sort is virtually inevitable, but two, I honestly don't think it's going to cause deep or serious problems in the anti-Saddam coalition. The Arab members of that coalition are part of it because it reflects their own vital interests, just as it does ours in the United States.
Once the military campaign is over, and if it is as effective as the President hopes that it is, what next for political developments in the Middle East?
Well, the key thing would be to try to defeat the Iraqis in Kuwait. We don't need to, indeed shouldn't try to destroy Iraq nor get involved in occupying Iraq. Over the longer term, if Saddam falls or at least withdraws from Kuwait, there is likely to be a need for some sort of American commitment in the Gulf region. But from our standpoint, hopefully a commitment which is more symbolic, which involves an American perhaps alliance or presence without a massive long-term presence of ground troops to make it tangible.
Realistically, you've been one of those who's been sounding the alarms about the need of the United States to develop a comprehensive Middle East policy. Realistically, what are the chances?
I think the chances aren't too bad. Obviously, we're in the middle of tumultuous events, and we don't want to jump to conclusions. But if the outcome of this conflict over the next few weeks is in the direction that many of us hope it will be, given the relative success of the bombing campaign so far. There might be some rays of hope in the long-term picture. Number one, the defeat of Saddam and the tremendous threat he poses to regional stability, given the fact that his weapons of mass destruction appear to be pretty well gone. Number two, the lesson that it's simply not acceptable to attack your neighbors for any reason at all, especially in cold blood. Number three, it strengthens the United Nations mechanism, the multilateral concept of trying to deal with threats to the peace in a collective way, in this case under U.S. leadership. And finally, I think there are reasons for at least cautious optimism about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. We can't expect miracles. The problem is an immensely difficult, even intractable one. But just as the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty of 1979 showed us, there are long-term possibilities, and in this case I think the defeat of Iraq might very well make Arab neighbors of Israel and even the Palestinians potentially more amenable to a long-term solution to the Middle East, in this case Arab-Israeli dimension of the conflict.
Professor Lieber, thank you very much. We'll ask you to stand by there in Washington.
Thank you.
As we tell everyone in our audience now that we'll have continuing coverage of America at War, Operation Desert Storm, right after this. Professor Lieber, we're back here for a few moments. Just share with me, if you can, your judgment about the relationship between President Bush and Yitzhak Shamir on a personal basis and whether that has any impact on policy. Well, we lost him. John Cochran?
Right.
John Cochran at the White House.
Can you hear me, Tom?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Right.
You answer that question.
Well, all right, let me answer it. I don't think it has anything to do with it. I think these people are playing for big stakes. I think George Bush is a pro. I think Yitzhak Shamir is a pro. And I don't think personal relationship has anything to do. They know each other well enough to figure out what the other one is up to. And whether they like each other or not really isn't terribly important. There's just too much at stake here, Tom.
Has Jim Baker been making most of the phone calls you indicated tonight? Why wouldn't President Bush get on the telephone? That's what he likes to do almost more than anything else.
You're right. There's something strange going on around here, and I haven't quite figured it out. For example, the president is insisting on leaving the Oval Office as though it's a normal work day. He's done it now 2 days in a row. Yesterday, we went to war, and he still, at 20 minutes past 6, walked over to the residence to have dinner with Barbara Bush and with Billy Graham. He wants to give the impression of, if not exactly business as usual, at least not a president who is down in the White House Situation Room and with a bunker mentality. It is unusual to have Secretary of State Baker doing all this calling, but Jim Baker is a lawyer. He's very good at this. He works with words very well. He's very legalistic, and I'm sure Jim Baker had a lot to do with the writing of the press statement that came out here a short time ago indicating what happened during his conversation with Shamir, in which Jim Baker assured Shamir that the United States would do its best, apparently with the British Air Force help too, do its best to retaliate against the Iraqis and knock out any remaining missile sites. However, nowhere in this statement, as we mentioned earlier, is there any indication that Prime Minister Shamir said, fine, you guys take care of it, we will sit back and do nothing. And earlier we had the Israeli ambassador making a big point of saying, listen, we took a chance for American political considerations, we did you guys a favor. Instead of going in and making a first strike against Saddam Hussein, we let you guys make your attack. We suffered an attack ourselves. We knew we were likely to get hit, and in fact we were hit. And it seems to me that the Israelis were saying that's once, and I'm not sure the Israelis are willing to say that's twice, Tom.
Thanks, John Cochran at the White House. Richard Lieber and Joyce Starr in Washington, two of our resident experts down there on what is going on in the Middle East, particularly with Israel. Would either of you be surprised if within the next year there is an international conference that must address the Palestinian question? Let's begin with you, Professor Lieber.
I'm sorry, we had your feed to John Cochran got in the way of your question to Joy Starr and myself.
All right. My question was, would either of you be surprised if within the next year there is an international conference that touches on the Palestinian question, among others, and that Israel ultimately will have to come to the table on that?
Well, it's conceivable, but it depends what you mean by conference. Conference is an awfully ambiguous word.
Well, let's make it a UN conference.
Well, if you make it a UN conference, I doubt it very much. The Israeli concern, and I think it's one the U.S. government under several administrations has understood, is that a big UN conference could very well lead into a kind of a demagogic ganging up on Israel, a kind of, to be blunt about it, mob psychology of the sort that in the mid-'70s produced the infamous Zionism is racism resolution. The Israelis won't have any part of it.
All right.
If, on the other hand, however, a conference is some sort of a vehicle by which there's an umbrella so that the Israelis can hold one-on-one negotiations with support from the Americans, possibly from the Soviets, if depending on the difficult situation in the Soviet Union, then you might get some progress in terms of negotiations. Even the Shamir government has hinted that something over the long term might be possible.
Joy Starr, what do you think?
I think that we should put aside the idea of a UN conference and think in terms of the peace process. And I would like to say to you that it's very fascinating that Saddam Hussein and also the Abu Nidal faction may have contributed more to Israel's confidence in a peace process than any other single action. If Saddam Hussein's military might is dismantled, and if Abu Nidal in fact has wiped out the top deputy of the PLO, then Israel is going to have more confidence in coming into a peace process.
Thank you very much. We'll be back after this.
From NBC News, America at War continues. Here is Tom Brokaw.
We're back now with continuing coverage of Operation Desert Storm, America at War, and it does continue at war tonight. It is now 8 a.m., the beginning of a Friday morning in Baghdad, throughout Iraq, throughout the military targets in Kuwait. We have every reason to believe that the non-stop sorties, as they're called, the bombing attacks on military targets, are going on. A wide array of airplanes involved, including B-52s, F-4s, F-15s, all kinds of planes, A-10s, almost everything that they can put in the air in the Persian Gulf. The alliance, led by the United States, is doing just that. NBC's Arthur Kent now is in Dhahran at the big Air Force complex there, and he has been witnessing a lot of those planes taking off. Can you predict when they're going to leave, Arthur?
No, we're just counting them, in fact, as they appear on the horizon, burning off at high speed, banking quickly, heading off to the west. Perhaps over the past hour, we've counted about 24 U.S. and Saudi F-15s. The British Royal Air Force is operating with Tornadoes as well. It's an overcast day, but of course, particularly after last night's events with the missile launchings at Israel, it seems that the pace has picked up suddenly after what was a very quiet early morning hours. We'd like to be able to go across the street, of course, Tom, to find out what's going on at the airbase, to find out whatever within the bounds of secrecy and security the U.S. Air Force could tell us about operations in Iraq and Kuwait today. But of course, we are forbidden by the rules set down by the Pentagon of doing so. Also, we're unable to put in an application or a request to go over and talk to the men of the minute, the fellows who fired that Patriot anti-missile last night that intercepted the incoming scud from Iraq. As you know, they've been that was one of the first units to establish itself at the beginning of this deployment, putting out their batteries of Patriots when the threat from Iraq was very real. Finally, last night, for the first time in the history of that weapon system, it was tested in combat, and we're unable, sadly, to go over and talk to that battery.
Arthur Kent, I remember I was there in those early days, and I was taken out in the middle of the night. We all got lost, couldn't find the Patriot missile battery, and then I found it the next day, and I kind of made my amends with the colonel, and he gave me a medallion from that unit. I think I'll go home tonight and rub it for good luck, because the first time that they were tested in combat, I know that you're relieved to know that they were able to shoot down that Scud missile. What about our colleagues who are up in the front with the ground troops as part of the Pentagon pool and Defense Department pool? Are you hearing from them at all?
Not regularly, and not at any interval that we can predict. We can report that we've shown to our viewers pretty well everything of any substance in the way of footage and interviews and information that we've gotten back from the various pools, and we're waiting anxiously, of course, to find out what else is going on, how the situation is developing on the ground, in the air, at sea, but we'll simply have to sit and hold our position, watch what we can, report to you what we can, and wait for the information back from those field units.
Do just that, if you would, for us, Arthur. We are grateful to you for your perseverance and your stamina there. We know it has been a long night, and you have another long day ahead of you. And our best to all of our colleagues, of course, from NBC News and the other journalists who are gathered in Dhahran. In Tel Aviv, NBC's Martin Fletcher has also had a long night, a terrifying scare that there may have been nerve gas in one of the warheads that the Iraqis launched. It turned out not to be true. Martin is there this morning and still at his post in Tel Aviv, and we are awaiting word from the Israeli government. It's my opening question once again, Martin. Still no word?
No word, Tom, on what Israel will do, whether Israel will retaliate for that Iraqi missile attack. As I said before, I'm absolutely convinced of one thing, that if the attack had included chemical warheads, then Israel would have retaliated immediately. Because it was conventional warheads only, now Israel's response is in question. The defense minister, the chief of staff, the army generals are meeting in the defense headquarters, and they're trying to work out right now what to do about it, whether to hit back or not.
Do you think that they will be taking any phone calls and advice from the United States, or will Jim Baker just call and say that we're outraged as well and hope that that will have the greatest impact for them?
Well, one thing this has certainly done is to increase the amount of strategic cooperation between Israel and the United States. In the early days of the last month, there was continual questions about whether or not Israel and the United States would coordinate in the region. It was felt that there was a very low level of cooperation, which worried Israel, because they were worried that if ever their planes did take off to attack Iraq, they may come across a situation where they'd be challenging American fighters in the plane, French or English fighters in the air, rather. So now, because of this, we hear there's very tight cooperation, as you can imagine, between Israeli and American strategic planners. So that's one plus, if you like, one good upside and a night full of downsides. But we're still waiting to see what's going to happen. We really don't know yet, Tom.
All right, Martin Fletcher, your colleague John Cochran is at the White House. He'd like to join in this discussion. John? John Cochran is at the White House or not?
I am at the White House, indeed, yes.
I thought you wanted to join in here. I thought you had something to add.
We'll have to evaluate just how valuable it is, but Professor Robert Lieber, a little while ago, earlier, when you were talking with him, said he did not think that the Arab coalition would fall apart if Israel were to attack Iraq. And he spoke about the fact that the Arab countries which have lined up against Saddam Hussein have national interests. They have reasons for being against Saddam Hussein, and simply an Israeli attack on Saddam Hussein would not require them to back out of the coalition. Well, I have to say this. They believe that here at the White House as well, to a degree. In other words, that's the way the governments feel. That's the way President Mubarak in Egypt feels. That's the way the president of Syria, Hafez al-Assad, feels. That's the way King Hassan of Morocco feels. That's the way the King of Saudi Arabia feels. The question is how their populations, how their Arab populations, the man on the street, is going to react. And that's what they're worried about here if Israel hits Iraq. And it's totally unpredictable. Now, Jordan certainly is not an ally in this coalition. Jordan has, if anything, sided with Saddam Hussein, although not militarily, but the Jordanians have pretty much sided politically. They're very nervous here about possible street demonstrations today in Amman. You were interviewing someone earlier from Amman. It was just getting to be dawn there. Well, the Palestinians take to the streets today in great numbers, celebrating this attack by Saddam Hussein on the Israelis. So it is the reaction of the general population, not the political leaders, Tom, that they're worried about.
John Cochran, thank you very much.